Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Usually not a problem. Thank you very much, first off, for everyone taking time out of their evening to come out to the Forbes School. Also, thank you to the Forbes School for hosting us tonight. Really excited to present on this embracing our legacy planning project that's been going on in Torrington for a little over 2 years, right around 2 years. Just introduce myself real quickly for anyone who has not met or I've not had the opportunity to meet. My name is William Wallach. I'm the Economic Development Director for the City of Torrington. I've been in this role since June of 2024, so coming up on a year. And I do little check-ins once in a while. So far, everybody said that my excitement level is still very high. So we can continue with that. This is another example of something that I'm really excited about and really passionate about. Before I came to Torrington, I was working at DECD, which is the Connecticut Department of Economic and Community Development, and I worked in Brownfield development there. And seeing projects like this throughout the state, it's really kind of cool to be on the other side, the municipal side, getting to actually effectuate a project like this. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is the planning process for evaluating what a brownfield property is in the city of Torrington and what a development opportunity we could do to bring in developers to improve that brownfield property. So let's take a step back, and I just want to define what I'm talking about, because a lot of different ideas that maybe some in the room aren't used to. A brownfield, very simply put, is a property that has some level of environmental contamination on it that makes it challenging to redevelop that site and to reuse that site. And so the property we're talking about across the street, the former Brunswick factory at 535 Beach Avenue, and also we'll talk about the north parcel as well. They have some environmental contamination on some ground soil issues, some hazardous building materials like asbestos, lead paint. And in order to clean that up, it's very costly, it's very expensive. And so usually developers are kind of hands off and say, not interested, don't want to deal with the environmental contamination, want to deal with the regulatory issues, the cost of cleanup. And so, as you can see, properties like that exist in Torrington and they remain vacant, they become blighted, they become overgrown, and it becomes kind of a nuisance eyesore of, I guess nobody's going to do anything about that. Tonight, you're going to hear that we're actually doing something about that. And this is really exciting. It's something that I just have a real strong passion for. This process started before I came on board. The city partnered with Gamble Associates. The city partnered with Weston & Sampson, and the city partnered with RKG, which is a marketing firm, both out of Massachusetts. So just real quick overview of what we're doing. That's kind of what we're talking about tonight. I want to thank the Department of Economic Community Development, DECD. I don't think there's any members here tonight, but they provided the funding to do this planning. So this is your tax dollars at work. Do a lot of really good concerted planning effort to figure out what we can do with a property like this. I also want to thank the Rhodes family. The Rhodes family are the owners of the property across the street that we're going to talk about tonight. They've been nothing but gracious and helpful in allowing us to undertake this project on part of their properties. So with that, I'll turn it over to David Gamble. He is the planning extraordinaire who has undertaken this project with the city. He's the principal for Gamble Associates and has done a fantastic job. He's going to kind of guide you through a lot of the work that's been done up to this point. Last thing I'll say before I hand over to Gamble, which is what I call him.
That's okay, Wallet.
Yeah, that's what I call him. I'm super excited to talk to him. Gamble. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer any questions. But I think just excitement, enthusiasm, and this is something that's going to be really great. With that, I'll hand it over. Thank you.
Thank you, William. I also wanted to thank Jeremy and Richard, Mayor Carbone. I think we have a few city council members, so thank you for coming. Your time is precious, and we appreciate that. How many of you are from Torrington? Raise your hand. I'm just curious. Okay, nearly everyone. How many of you might have been here about a year ago when we did a brainstorming session. A couple, okay. If you weren't here, that's fine. We're going to cover a lot of ground. I'm an architect and urban planner with Gamble Associates. We work on a lot of big, vacant, mostly contaminated buildings and markets that don't always sustain them in contemporary fashion. And there's a lot of those things, as you can imagine, around New England and around the country. So we've been delighted to partner with the city on a very important project. If I can see a show of hands, how many of you have actually been through the 535 Midgen complex at some point in your time? How many of you are students in this school? Just a couple. Okay, great. Well, housekeeping restrooms are right across the hallway, I just found out. And for those of you that are joining us remotely, I think there's at least this many people remotely, and I hope they can hear me okay. Yes. Okay, great. So we're going to give you an overview of some challenges that exist, but also some opportunities, and clarify unknowns that sometimes are below the ground or in the building, and why projects like this seem to struggle, and how one might overcome them. See here. You need to move your cursor there for a second. Right. So we're talking about two areas together. One is what's called the 13-acre parcel. You wouldn't know where it is because you can't actually get to it, but it's very close to the river. It was the former landfill from the manufacturing complex of 535. We're going to talk about that landscape adjacent to the river. And Torrington, and in fact, the entire region has a pretty remarkable trail network. This area along the river lends itself very well to an extension of that trail network. Trails are catalysts around the country. More and more people are interested in getting access to the outdoors. The public in general demands access to fresh water and to waterfronts. This is an opportunity to build off of the network that you have. But unless you're in a butter to the property, and there may be some of you online or in the room, you can't get to it. You can't see how spectacular it actually is today. We are in this circle at the 535 in the manufacturing complex. It's currently zoned for general business, although it was, of course, mostly industrial for much of its life. And I don't know if any of you had worked there when it was a manufacturing complex, but it had quite a reputation. In fact, as my colleague Eric will talk about, Connecticut in general, and certainly Torrington, has a tradition of manufacturing that exists today, and in fact is growing as a market. So the notion that a couple 100,000 square feet of space in this complex could be industrial again is not out of the realm of possibility. I also want to thank the Rhodeses who granted us access to the buildings. We've been through them. We've met with them at least half a dozen times. He has owned it for almost a decade, and they themselves, the property owner, is interested in seeing something else happen. So that's a good sign. When we met last May, there was about this many people, not quite as many, and there were some themes that came out about what would you like to see happen here, or what might stymie its potential. If you're sitting in the back, feel free to come a little bit closer because the font is small, but there's a general desire to see something happen. It's been languishing for a long time. Connect this area to downtown, which is actually quite close. It just seems a lot farther because of the walk and the infrastructure to get from place to place. So proximity-wise, it's actually not very far from your downtown core, which also has a lot of assets. Making sure that something happens and there's follow through. So William in particular has been pushing us to make sure that it's not a report that sits on a shelf, but that we move towards implementation. And in fact, good news, because we've been able to secure more resources to do some more environmental testing. Not seeing more big box retail, that was a desire that people said less of that would be great. Making sure there are resources to reposition buildings like this. It might seem that big old industrial buildings are less expensive than new construction, but it's not always the case. In fact, sometimes older industrial buildings need more investment simply to shore them up and to remediate them before you bring in new uses. I used to think, well, it's an existing building, it must be cheaper than building a new thing, but not always, so that is one of the challenges. So the themes that came out of that, if I aggregate the different topics, were connectivity. And that's where this notion of a trail lends itself very well to this property across the street. Making sure that it becomes kind of a destination in a mix of uses that add to what you have downtown. What would be unfortunate is if what happens here siphons away activity from other places that are already in your downtown. So you want something to be distinctive, you want it to be something that adds and doesn't siphon away activity. And again, making sure that one follows through. Those were kind of the general themes that came out from those conversations. We had a lot of kind of one-on-ones too, with some names that may be familiar to you. People that are in certain sectors or have a certain relationship to the site. These were many different conversations over individual topics. Maybe some of you are here or online, which is great. The history of this place is amazing. And your history center is amazing. Wouldn't it be great to celebrate that even more through a project like this revitalization? So in those conversations, there are also some themes that have emerged. This is actually Kimberly Rock. I see her and her husband at corkboard.com, which is a great adaptive reuse of an old industrial building right along the river. Don't you want to take on something bigger? But this is the notion that this portion of the state actually does have a tradition of manufacturing that continues today, and that there is even contemporary uses that can occupy former industrial spaces that might lend themselves well. I'm not saying that they would move here, but I'm saying that there are things like this already that are happening in your region. I haven't spoken to a single person that didn't talk about the need for basketball courts, for soccer fields, for pickleball, for rock climbing. It's a very active, recreation-minded region. And the Port Armory is, I think, maxed out in terms of its capacity as a single space to harbor some of those uses. So active recreation is certainly a catalyst for new uses, and believe it or not, could find themselves into a complex like this. There's your great armory, also not far away, but seems much farther. Right this way. We had great conversations with ONG, which is obviously a big contractor in the States, and that there is this opportunity perhaps to think about leveraging that expertise and getting some of the organizations and industries in the city involved in adaptive reuse. There has been some housing, but actually not as much as you might think. Loft conversions are a fairly common adaptive reuse of older industrial properties. Now, these buildings that I'm pointing across the street actually dimensionally aren't ideal for housing. A couple of them would work well, but unlike the one you have downtown where there are hundreds of units, there just isn't a lot of this here, which also lends itself to potential. And the new construction that has happened has filled up pretty quickly. So there's demand. There's demand for housing, whether it's new construction or in older industrial buildings. So I'm about to turn it to my colleague to talk about the market in a more detail, but we think that there's a couple, I want to say, brands or concepts around which a property like this could be repositioned. And one is thinking about it as a kind of industrial manufacturing campus. You've got an amazing Votech, also actually looking for more space. Young adults who are looking to get into this industry need spaces like this. So one concept is to try to bring together more light manufacturing in spaces that did that 100 years ago. And we think that has some traction. A different vision, it could be complementary because there's a lot of space, but a different vision would be around health and wellness. And that idea about occupying some of the spaces for courts, for exercise, for relationships with local healthcare institutions that are looking for space. And in that sense, it would be about a community for people of all ages, including from daycare to active adults. And that might be a way to differentiate the site from competitors. And then the third version, and there's lots of variations in between, is making it really a mixed-use destination. And there are enough buildings of different sizes that work very well for different uses. So imagine a place to work, a place to live, a place to exercise, a place to recreate, a place to grab a beer. There's enough variation in the fabric of the building to do that in the future. And as architects and planners, we've looked at these buildings typologically, that is to say dimensionally, and how they might work here. This is building number 9, which is the administration building. When you enter the complex off of Midgeon, would work pretty well for housing. Not a lot, but 10 to 12 units would fit very easily in a building that is actually domestically scaled as that is. Or if you view towards the river and you see the smokestack, well, that was the boiler house, of course, as these manufacturing campuses had boiler houses. That's about 3,500 square feet. Actually 4,600 would work great for restaurants, brew pubs, anything that needs, this room is about 4,500 square feet. So it's not a huge area, but it could lend itself to something like that, that's entertainment. Or even building 13, which I know you don't know the numbers, but even smaller buildings that could be incubator spaces, maker spaces for entrepreneurs, for businesses that are looking to display their local work. So any of those actually are pretty good places to start. And in our experience, one of the things that stymies repositioning of big complexes is in fact their size. They're daunting. 200,000 square feet will not likely be absorbed by a single entity. A silver bullet very seldom comes. However, if you can find smaller buildings that are a little bit easier to reposition because they're smaller and maybe they're not as contaminated or deteriorated, that often is the point of entry into the site's transformation. And so those 3 buildings themselves are not very big, but if you have 3 or 4 pieces that start to change, that creates momentum. And momentum is, as William said, really what's needed at the moment. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Eric. He's going to hit some high-level notes on the market. We're going to talk a little bit about what lies beneath. It's not as bad as you might think. And then we're going to conclude by drilling down into some of these scenarios and talk a little bit more about the future. Yeah, and I can bring this up.
Hello, everyone. So as you saw, David presented a set of concepts or sort of ideas for thinking about the site. And so what I want to do is take a quick moment to take a step back and sort of talk through what informed a lot of that sort of thinking and conceptual work in the more early stages of the project. And I would just start off by saying we have a very robust report with lots of charts and figures and research that backs everything that I'm going to be talking about today. I believe you can reach out to William to get a hold of that if you're interested. And afterward, I'm happy to talk about any of the findings that I'm about to discuss. And so just to sort of start out, I really want to present a really high level. Can everyone hear me fine? Sorry. A really high level overview of what's been going on in the market. And to sort of put this in context for you all, in the early stages of this project, it's really important to understand what's going on in the market, both in Torrington, but also regionally. And by market, I mean business activity, what sort of developments are happening, where are we seeing employment growth, what type of industries are growing or contracting based on broader economic conditions, who's moving in and out of communities around the region, where are they spending their money, and sort of how is this driving commercial development in the region, and in this case in Torrington. And so I'm going to hit on a few sort of strengths, some opportunities, some challenges, and sort of I suppose threats or uncertainty points, and then I'll put that in the context of a few uses that we thought would be the strongest to consider on this site, and then as you'll see later on, how this sort of worked into the plans that David discussed. And so to really just hit on the high level sort of strengths, I think as everyone knows, Torrington's an employment center. It has this huge manufacturing base. And lots of people commute from around the region into Torrington, as well as those who live and work in Torrington. And it's really advantageous at this point in time that there is this strong manufacturing base, because both at the federal and state level, there are a lot of programs and monies that are really working to increase talent pipelines for advanced manufacturing. There's a lot of funding for new flex and industrial spaces, because as the decades have gone on, manufacturing is made very important, but it's really sort of pivot in the footprint and the type of production that's going on in these spaces. And so a site like this is a perfect example of where you already have a lot of manufacturers, you already have a labor force near the community and working in this community that can sort of be used as a talent pool for these types of developments. Other things to sort of mention include the fact that aside from the stable employment base, a lot of these buildings are in relatively good condition. And the demand for not only industrial and flex space, but also housing and retail, as we've seen, as I'll highlight a little bit later, there's been a lot of new retailers here in Torrington. And the other thing is, from the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of out-migration occurred from the New York City metro, and a lot of the western side of Connecticut really benefited from new residents working remotely, looking for a change from the city. And what that's meant is a much higher consumer base living locally, looking to spend locally. And a lot of these households, particularly on that higher income side, really had a lot of savings after the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you read any sort of newspaper or the Wall Street Journal, they've really been driving the economy over the past couple of years. And so that's really a good sort of marker of thinking about commercial opportunity and how to leverage spending. To just really briefly touch upon some of the things that we see as weaknesses, but also sort of those challenges that must be considered or overcome when thinking about repositioning the site. While there is a very strong employment base, something that's very characteristic not only here, but in New England more broadly, a lot of the important employment base is starting to get older. You know, in the next 10 or 20 years, many will be looking to retire. And this is particularly true in production and manufacturing based industries. And so what's really important is training new talent, considering educational programs that sort of bring younger workers into these very key industries. And so that's something that not only Torrington and the region faces, but New England more broadly. And again, this is one of those things that is a weakness, but also an opportunity because of a lot of federal and state programs that are working to address that particular challenge. A few other things to mention is that, as David mentioned before, this market study really sort of underscored the need for housing. And this is something, you know, the state more broadly is struggling with. One of the challenges to housing is while it's much easier to build at scale, when you start building at smaller scale, financing and construction costs really play an impactful role. And so things like remediation or lower rents really can sort of inhibit properties from being redeveloped in these smaller scales. So just another thing to consider, although again, housing is another state priority and there's many funding sources to consider. But again, as far as weaknesses or things to really consider for repositioning property, those are things to consider. Moving on to barriers, this is something we can consider these more as points of uncertainty or other things to consider. Again, as I'm sure you all are aware, interest rates have sort of flatlined at their current level, meaning the cost of capital is pretty high. And given certain things going on in the broader economy today, there's a lot of uncertainty about what labor and construction costs might look like over the medium to longer term. And so This will provide some level of uncertainty for different types of developments. Other things to consider is while flex and industrial space as well as retail space are really strong in the region, in cases like multifamily, rents are really important to support development. And when there's things like remediation, that can make these kinds of things more challenging. But a few things I want to cover more on the opportunity sides, and this is what's going to lead to the last few slides that I want to show, is really the ways in which we think this site could be activated. So one of the first things, as David had alluded to, is there is this sort of ecosystem of artists, makers. These complement very well with things like flex and smaller industrial space, which is also what a lot of advanced manufacturing tend to prefer. So you have this sort of complementary arts and historical manufacturing, which tend to use the same space. And so when thinking about multiple users or ways of activating the site from multiple different avenues, this is a great opportunity. There's been growth in the younger workforce more broadly in the region. Again, meaning more opportunities for housing. Other things to think about is the sort of changing demographics. There's something that I highlighted in the report, but I'll just call out here. There's this funny little trend called the Starbucks effect. Typically, when a community sees a Starbucks built, it usually means that they are positioning one because they see a lot of market potential. And so that tends to be good for related retailers. And so things like that can be viewed as a good sort of indicator of local activity from a commercial and retail perspective. And so you have seen a lot of things like that, as well as lumber and hardware supplies, supporting things like manufacturing and construction. So those are all positive markers for other types of commercial development. And so just to sort of distill this into, so what does this mean for the site, and how do we sort of position all of these sort of data points and indicators into what could be a vision for this site and potential uses? So what I have here is just sort of an example of what a light manufacturing, advanced manufacturing space looks like. It tends to have less equipment than more traditional manufacturing types. They tend to be a smaller footprint, and they tend to require a higher skilled or more computer-based labor force. And again, this is something that state and federal programs are looking to really support and position as key strengths, particularly in places like New England, where manufacturing is such a main historical driver of economic activity. And so to just sort of extend that point a little bit further, we did a little bit of a look surveying the local workforce and other opportunities where we're seeing this sort of complementary activity related to industrial and manufacturing. And so what I've called out here, there's a few pictures that you can see down on the left-hand corner. Naugatuck Valley Community College has a very good advanced manufacturing program, and they were actually looking to expand and ended up expanding in Danbury, where they have further bays for CNC and other types of advanced manufacturing activities, where they have all sorts of classes. And as David mentioned before, with the technical high school and a lot of that base already here, opportunities for reskilling or looking at funds from both educational as well as public sources, and sort of looking at this as an opportunity to expand the talent pool and utilize space. It makes it a nice sort of complementary opportunity for this site. Another example, as I mentioned before, is retail. And here I just highlight a few pictures in which older mill buildings have been repositioned as places to hang out. Usually retail today is really driven by a grocery anchor, or if it's more experiential. And by experiential, that usually means there's a brewery, there's other places to spend your money or hang out, and they really feel more like a place. And one of the nice things about this particular site is that it is this sort of campus feel. It is a place. And so you can imagine if there's a brewery or other retailers or maker spaces, it becomes a place now where you can spend the afternoon, have a drink, shop a little bit, and sort of engage in other ways, all in a single place. And again, as David had mentioned, and I briefly touched upon, housing is a huge priority for the state, and it is a really core need. when we were looking at the Northwest Hills region, so all the housing in the effectively Litchfield County, there hasn't been a lot of new housing development, but of the new developments that have occurred, they get absorbed very quickly into the market, meaning they get leased up very quickly. And that's a really good indicator that there is a lot of demand for housing. One of the challenges is unless you build at a larger scale, it becomes a little bit more challenging to finance smaller projects. And so that's one of the challenges with developing housing. And so you have to reconcile remediation costs, the smaller scale, cost of capital, and then the asking rents for that building. And so that's another important opportunity, but again, one of those things that there are trade-offs. And then as David had also mentioned, another key use and market that we found is in this sort of sports and active recreation. We had done some interviews with local soccer organizations, and they expressed the need for more space. They're really filling up the armory and when they're playing indoors. And as a growing up in Woodbury, Connecticut, I used to have to drive all the way to Farmington to play soccer indoors. So just thinking about opportunities for other soccer leagues and youth organizations to have a place indoors through the winter to keep practicing. One of the buildings on the site that David will go into more detail is a perfect opportunity for considering something like indoor soccer facilities and other types of active recreation use. The other picture that I have here is pickleball courts in Oxford. I flagged that as well, just because that was recently built and it seems like it's really hard to play there because everyone's trying to play there and it's very popular these days. So again, that's another use that you could envision in the space, and given the location of the space, usually the top concern is the noise in something like pickleball, and that's a space where noise would be less of a concern. So, another good marker for an opportunity there. And then that's all I have on the market component. I will say, like I said in the beginning, there is a very long report that I'm sure you could reach out to William if you're curious about reading. And again, if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer in more detail, but I'll pass it over to John to talk about the environmental side of things.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Good evening, everybody. I just want to start again by said this last meeting for those of you that were here. Thank Gamble for having me on the team. My family has a history in Torrington since the turn of the last century. My father was born just on the other side of the river on Smith Street. Both grandparents worked in the local factories, one at Torrington Company and one at the Brass Mill. And my grandmother ended up in her later years at the Towers. So this project and its locale in Torrington is extremely important to me. So my name is John Zabel. I work with Weston and Sampson Engineers. We're out of Rocky Hill, Connecticut. I'm a licensed environmental professional, and I'll go into the importance of that as I move through the presentation. Gamble had hired Weston and Sampson to be part of the project team to look at the environmental history of the subject property. I know we've talked a lot about industrial, commercial, residential, and you'll see how the environmental data that we were able to review interplays with that at the property. So as you've heard tonight, there's two separate parcels. The first one I'll cover quickly is the manufacturing parcel. Okay, here we go. Go back one. Go back one. Yeah, what's the, okay, no. Good. There you go. Okay, so what was involved in the environmental study aspect? It basically was a third-party review. Again, much work has been done on the property across the street. Brunswick was a former owner of the property, had a legacy of manufacturing operations at the site, and environmental consultants for Brunswick, as they left the site, ended up doing a fair bit of environmental investigation. These investigations were done over a 10-year period between about 1995 and 2005. And that's the data that was available for our review, both through state records. Brunswick did provide us some information that wasn't in the state's public purview yet for review. And all that data was compared to the remediation standard regulations. William loves when I throw out acronyms, so I won't use RSRs. Basically, our task was also to complete what I'll refer to as a data gap analysis. What do we know about the existing environmental condition, and what needs to be done to find out more based upon these great plans that David has, based upon the market study that Eric's group has done, and how do we fill those gaps? What's actually required from an environmental standpoint to do that? Again, as I mentioned before, the first property we looked at is the about 11.5 acre Brunswick Mill property, the buildings we see right across the street. As David mentioned, total of 14 buildings, and much of the other space on the property, and this is very significant from an environmental standpoint, are paved parking areas. As I mentioned, long history of industrial use, making hardware and sporting goods. And these processes that are listed, the forging, the casting, the heat treating, stripping, degreasing, all resulted in the use of chemicals and petroleum products on the property. And as we know, back then, at the turn of the century, up until maybe the 1980s, I would say, there weren't a lot of regulations for the management or handling of those materials. So spills or discharges or things of that nature were more commonplace, certainly than they are today. As I mentioned, in the mid-90s to the early 2000s, there was a series of environmental investigations done under the property transfer program. Basically, in Connecticut, when you have an industrial property, if it has certain uses or there's X amount of hazardous chemicals that exceed a certain volume that were disposed of from the property, when the property is sold, it triggers the need to do an environmental assessment. So that's how the property ended up in this program, the property transfer program. 14 areas of concern, or AOCs, I think that comes in a later slide, so I'll use that, were identified. Those are basically areas where there was contamination that was found in the soil, in the groundwater, and required further assessment. And some of the contaminants are volatile organics, semi-volatile, cyanide, metals, PCBs, again, contaminants that would be used in the processes I mentioned earlier. The most significant environmental document, or one of, was a remedial action plan that was submitted by Brunswick to the state agency in 2005. And what that presented was a plan to clean up the property to industrial commercial standards. And that's important when I get later into the slides and we talk about the data gaps that we have. So Brunswick, understanding that they had caused some contamination of the property, did these investigations and determined, okay, this is what would need to be done. We need to excavate some soil. We have to impose land use restrictions on the property, and we'll get into those. And those are significant to some of David's plans for potential future uses. And then monitored natural attenuation, which is basically, okay, there's certain levels of contaminants in the groundwater. We're going to take a look at those and let those naturally degrade over time. In terms of active remediation that's been completed in 2006, approximately 1,700 cubic yards of soil was removed from specific areas of the site to meet cleanup goals. And between 2006 and 14, Brunswick had implemented a groundwater monitoring program. Brunswick currently has drafted, they haven't been submitted yet, but these land use restrictions. They're currently proposed. We've obtained copies, we've looked at them, and what they would allow for, again, in an industrial reuse scenario, which is what the building currently is slated as, certain soils could be left in place at certain criteria, but more importantly, one of the land use restrictions would restrict future use on the land records for residential use only, and that's where we stand as of today. So this is the manufacturing parcel here. It's kind of hard to see. The hatching represents the buildings, and the blue areas represent areas where you cannot dig, remove asphalt, or disturb the soil. And as you can see, some of those are beneath the buildings. That's on top of saying this property has to stay residential use. So then we come to the north parcel. As David had said, it is directly connected, although not visible from the street or from the property until you get well into the property. It's about 13 acres. There's some debate exactly how much is on the land records versus how much aerial space there is on a map. It is directly adjacent to the Naugatuck River, and I don't know if you can see in the above shot, it's absolutely picturesque. As David had said, it's just natural land. But again, as David had discussed, what lies beneath is different than what you may see on the surface. For years, it was used as a landfill, which is not uncommon in the state of Connecticut. These large manufacturing parcels had property surrounding their land. It was lower lying than the existing facility. So what did they do? They placed solid waste there. That area was assessed about the same time as the manufacturing parcel by Brunswick. And it was determined that about 1.7 acres or 18 feet thick of material had been deposited. It basically was waste such as tires, plastics, glass, basically anything that resulted from the manufacturing that they didn't need. In 2017, prior to COVID, Brunswick had submitted the closure application to the DEP for areas of waste to be relocated, and we'll look at a map of that quick, and that waste to be consolidated on the site. That would also require the use of a non-disturbance recorded on the land records for that particular area. In 2022, right at the beginning of COVID, actually, Connecticut DEP approved their closure plan. Now, again, although it will be capped, that plan requires long-term obligations to confirm that the cap remains in place, that groundwater is monitored, and that any repairs be made should they be identified. So this is the consolidation plan here. The blue areas, which are shaded, there's a small one to the page left, and then a couple continuous areas of blue into green. The blue are areas where solid waste would be removed and would be placed on top of the green area, which also includes some solid waste. So the edges are a little bit thinner, the veneers, and would be placed on top of the green areas. But before I go into David's study here, a lot of what our work resulted in was, what are these data gaps? What needs to be done? And essentially from an environmental standpoint, there's two. As you saw during one of my slides, the bulk of the investigation ended in about 2005. Well, as we know, the property, although it seems vacant, there have been some activities occurring and lease spaces at the property. Those activities may have resulted in an additional contamination. So what needs to be done is we have to fill that, what I'll call it, it's a time data gap between 2005 and the present. The other data gap is, as I mentioned, the environmental plan for the property as it currently stands is to keep it industrial commercial. And the reason that's a gap is if you want to go to a residential standard, additional investigation may be needed. So William reached out to Weston and Sampson, I'd say in the summer, early fall of 2024, last year. And it was during a round where the DECD had put forth availability for funding. So with the help of Weston and Sampson, the town of Torrington submitted a grant application for assessment and remediation of the parcels. One thing my slides didn't cover is the hazardous building materials that David had pointed out. Again, due to the age of the structures, there's asbestos, potential lead-based paint, potential PCBs. All that needs to be looked at both in a demolition or a future use scenario. So back to the grant application, in September of 2024, Torrington submitted to the DECD a grant application for $200,000 for additional assessment and remediation. Assessment, excuse me, not remediation. But that would be used to assess both the above grade, the hazardous building materials, and below grade contaminants to address those data gaps that I mentioned. And in December of 2024, the city was awarded the $200,000 grant. That I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, John. How's everybody doing? I see a lot of people on the edge of their seats, but I assume you're ready to get up. But bear with us. I know we're throwing a lot at you. This session is being recorded, and then we also have a full report, and then a market report and an environmental report. So a lot of what this effort is removing the unknowns that clarify for a development partner what's there and what they might need to move forward. And in my experience, that's a big part of repositioning these properties, is what is actually there and what needs to be done. If there are two things I'd like you to leave tonight with, one is that these things take a long time. But in the life of a city, in the life of this complex, it may actually not be that long. So 100 years ago, there's even evidence of that. These buildings were here, some of these buildings were here. It's going to take a little bit of time, but we are making progress. And part of it is through these grants, and part of it is through the overlap of the environmental, the market, and the design. So bear with me. I'm going to rifle through this a little bit a little faster about some of these other reuse options of how the market and the environmental come together, and to orient you. So we're here now in the Forbes School. This is that boiler house when John showed the blue hatches. A lot of that, of course, was around where the smokestack was, as you can imagine. And then this is that building number 9 that I keep talking about would be great for 10 to 12 or 20 units of housing, depending upon the size. So the 3 buildings that I'm highlighting here in pink are the administration building, building 9, the boiler house, building 5, and then this building, little building 6A, which is only 3,000 square feet. So the drawing suggests that might be a good place to start. If there's any developers online, you don't have to do a whole lot to get some activation here. And those 3 would be a pretty good place to start, with, of course, the river being this blue thread that connects to the rest of your region. Maybe I'll just ask you, Richard, to move forward, and I'm going to move over here. So I'll let you just advance it. So it's curious to us also that if you just spring over the river, you're into another residential neighborhood. And in fact, most of the, what I would call mill towns, had lots and lots of housing around it because the workers would walk to the mill. And it, we're sort of interested in Toll Street and the way in which one might just skip over if there was a bridge, if there was a connection to the neighborhood. This property will become more valuable if it's connected to things around it. We think that might be a long-term consideration to imagine some type of pedestrian bridge across Dale Street. Next. There's this connection that's almost here. There's a dead-end street. There's a parking lot for the Community Health and Wellness Building. The property is actually well positioned for transformation because you can drive around it. You can navigate around it, which means parking can be dispersed in different locations, which should allow different buildings to be activated in different ways. So that's an idea about maybe making a connection there, or even here, literally across the street, there's a dead end. And one possible reuse is just to park in some of these bigger buildings because people have to park, but you can park covered in this building, which actually has a solid brick wall. Next. So the interiors are actually in pretty good shape as big old industrial buildings go. We've been through all of them but one, and we'll get into that eventually. And these are just a few of those images. Next. This is that drawing a little bit bigger. So the orange line suggests get from Midgeon to the river as quickly as possible. That's actually a great place to walk if the boiler house was a destination. You could park even here and walk across the street. That's an important alignment. Next. And there are lots of good examples of industrial buildings that have done that, have activated the public realm. This could be a place that's very pedestrian oriented, actually. This is a photo from Oregon. Next. So reinforce that relationship from the river to the boiler house. It looks like that, but it wouldn't take a whole lot to fix the pavement, remove the cars, plant some trees, pick up some pavement, make it impervious surfaces, and it would be a nice place to walk. It's right now a parking lot. To the casual observer, even to the informed citizen driving by, it looks terrible now. It does, but it doesn't take a lot to make that better. That's the good sign. Next. So this should be a principle in the site's revitalization, is get to the river and improve that access. Next. And so here, that would mean that maybe these are the first 3 buildings to move ahead. 14 buildings is a lot. 3 is more manageable. You just have to get things started. Next. And this is the boiler house. And if you just move those out of the way, activate that. It's about 4,600 square feet, we said, the size of this room. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. That would get people to come down to the end. Like a mall has anchors, right? This is an anchor. This building is an anchor. Next. And if you've ever been to Asheville or lots of cool, funky spaces, little buildings can be lots of different things, and that's what this alignment could do. Next. Another principle is that the back side of the buildings could actually be thought of more as the fronts. If you're along the river, each of these buildings, this is the back side of these buildings, they actually have doors. And if that became more of a amenity, the buildings themselves would reorient to the river, and it's probably as they should, because that's where more activity can be. Next. So we think that should be a principle, which means that this alignment, again, we're here, here's Midgeon, the river, that could be reinforced. You've got a place to park, you know, here's community health and wellness, here's the backside. Maybe the developer starts here and she does 100,000 square feet instead of 200,000 square feet. So depending upon what you invest in, it signals or it triggers different buildings to be rehabilitated. And these are different strategies. Next, which again is a good thing. So if you're floating up above the smokestack and that became a better place to walk, more green, more pedestrian oriented, it would suggest that these spaces become activated. Next. And you look at that today, you think it's a dump. Next. However, with a little bit of love and attention and some green and some signage and wayfinding, and here's just off of the image is the boiler house, that would be a pretty remarkable place. Next. And there's lots of good examples of buildings at this scale that could be some of those uses. Next. Let's talk about the administration building. It's building number 9. It's about 3,800 square feet per floor times 3.5 floors. 11 to 14 units is very viable. It actually works pretty well as a residential unit because it has a core in the middle, and it even has a what would be an elevator shaft here. Next. So we think that that would be a great reuse opportunity together with the building next to it. So next, another strategy is to say, let's focus on the buildings that are most visible from Midgeon, because that has how many cars a day? 40,000 cars a day?
Yeah.
A lot that are heading up here. So maybe the developer starts with these 3 buildings, which is again about a third of the complex. So this is all good news because there's a whole variety of ways that these could be repositioned depending upon the uses. Next. And so this is an idea. There was an artist until fairly recently, a very well-known artist from Brooklyn who occupied the space on the 2nd floor, which I wanted to have this meeting there because I think it would have just been amazing for you to see it. And naturally, there are concerns about liability because you could just meander around the whole complex. And so the property owner wasn't quite comfortable enough doing it, but maybe the next meeting. So bear with us. But that space is unbelievable. Here's the future residential. Next. And then this building, again, could be so many different things. This is the one building we haven't gotten into. It's 3 stories, very high ceilings. It's just filled with too much stuff, but we hope to get in there soon. Next. And that, if you opened up this bottom of the brick facade, got us there and there, this would, again, be a third of the complex. Next. Both Eric and my colleague mentioned sort of cool, funky industrial spaces that could be active recreation. You may have snickered at pickleball, but it is such a craze And because it would be indoors, it could be a great reuse opportunity. Next, this shows skateboarding. And what's interesting is that the newest buildings in the complex are newest, I mean, from the 60s and 70s, are in the back. But these are the buildings that have no columns because that's where they manufactured golf club shafts. So it's wide open. If you haven't been there, you probably wouldn't have been. Next. So we think that another strategy is to say, let's start along the river's edge in these newer buildings, which have less contamination. Next. And take a space like this where all of the boats are stored every winter. Maybe some of you have your boats there. It's just brings in revenue for the property owner, but not that much. Look at the volume of that space. Next, it is, I think, like 32 feet to the underside of those trusses, and there are no columns. You could literally put in a semi-professional soccer field in the center of that space. Next, it's 28 feet to the bottom of the truss to the purlin. It's 33 feet to the top, and it's 20-foot base. So I know the city's looking for places for new courts, new soccer pitches. Imagine if it was indoors and you could play year round. Next, or lots of other things. This is the flea market. If you're here on a Saturday, you probably are. I've been here twice on a Saturday walking through the flea market. That's an amazing building. It's also 100 feet wide. Too wide for a residential. That's actually, you wouldn't get enough natural light, but it could be lots of other things. Next. And then I haven't been to an old industrial complex that didn't have a good place to eat. And Torrington's got some great cuisine, and wouldn't it be awesome if there was a way to put some of that here? Next. And that we think, one more, could be in this kind of central courtyard. Go ahead, next. Which is right past the gateway. So this is yet another way in which the whole complex could be repositioned, is do it right around where the most boating entrances are, which is right here, next, right past the administration building, right here, next, we're calling the central courtyard. Again, if you walk by this, you think that looks bad, the next, but imagine if it were well programmed. I think you have a classic car show that happens out in a McDonald's parking lot or something. I mean, that should happen here. You know, that should happen. Events that bring people to the property like this would be great. Next. And then lastly, connect to the community. The river is really the greatest asset. And if you can get back there at this location, you'd really be amazed as we were. Next. And the notion that right along this edge, as the trail could come across and connect to the boiler house, and that's even a shed next. We think that would be a great place to start. Even if that happened in the next couple of years, you extend the trail, the boiler house gets stabilized, that would be a success. That would be momentum, and that's actually possible. Next. And that's what it looks like when you're at the river. You can barely see the building. This is even in the winter. Next, but once the trail comes through and you've got some better lighting and you plant some trees and you actually cut down the invasive species so you can see the river, this is the stuff, these are the ingredients of revitalization. Access, nature, uses that are synergistic with other things. Next, and that's about 3,000 square feet. So those are some principles that a development entity would be kind of curious about, and together with the economic piece and the environmental piece, those are some of the things that will trigger transformation. Next. And so where does one start? That sort of depends upon the type of developer. Some will do mostly housing. It's harder to find a developer that does a whole mix of uses. They all tend to specialize. So some do residential, some do light industrial, some do retail. That is another challenge here, is if it's going to be a mixed-use complex, you need I would say, a sympathetic developer who's interested in urban revitalization and has some patient capital, because it is a harder project than a greenfield site where you're going to build a new factory or something. This is harder. It takes more time, but they are out there, and there's a lot of them in New England actually that we've been trying to stir the pot and let them know about this site. Next. So I think we're over an hour. I apologize. I know it's a lot to absorb. We could show you lots of other things, but at this point, I think it'd be most productive for us to hear from you about some of the things we said and to try to answer any questions you may have. And do we have a roving mic?
We do not have a roving mic.
If you have a question or a remark, if you could just state your name and we'll try to answer any questions you have. And if we can handle them here in-house first, and then we can go online. Does that work? Great. Okay, so Richard will, if there's comments. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Ben Gladstone,
Hey, Ben.
and
Welcome back to the school.
oh yeah. And my question is, since the place is on Hitchin Avenue going towards Route 4 West,
Mhm.
it's perfectly located for like a bus stop, maybe even with a pedestrian bridge over the street so people going west and can reach the place.
I think you're right that the site is a little bit isolated from downtown at the moment. Public transit would help. I'm not even sure how much transit there is on Midgeon, if there's a bus line along that lane.
So I think public transportation would need to be reoriented to better accommodate the improvements that go into that location. But it's certainly something that would be in the scope of the city's purview and also the Northwest Transit District purview.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's going towards like Norfolk and Cornwall
Yes.
and all those
Yeah,
towns.
I was amazed when I drove north up into those towns north of here, and it's an incredible part of the state. And you're right, it has high visibility in that way.
People in those towns need somewhere to
They
go.
do need somewhere to go. That's right. Yeah.
And the-
Fall Village, let's do something urban and fun here.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking is that the it's cool how like all these buildings could be reused somehow.
Yeah, the comment was because the buildings are different sizes, they can accommodate different uses, and that is a differentiating factor here. We're working with Weston and Sampson on a mill yard in Sanford, Maine, and it's 1 million square feet, and nearly every building is the same size, which means that it'll be harder to get the right adaptive reuse. So Ben's right. The different size buildings means potentially a lot of different programs.
So I think it'll appeal to the areas northwest of here.
Great point.
So I think another point for transportation, but also to the connectivity item is the development of this. There's no reason for a bus stop in front of 535 Midgeon Ave right now, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's going except for the few people that work there, unless you're dropping off your boat at the end of the season. We go through a development process. A couple years from now, we've got some much more significant occupied space for commercial use or soccer matches or whatever, right? That increases the use of this property. It increases the reason for a bus stop there. I think it's a great point.
But that'll drive more people here because if you live in one of these towns and you see a job here, you won't need to own a car.
I think I'll add to that is the trail connectivity piece, where you see these images that David showed of people riding their bikes, not images, the drawing, right? The renderings of people riding their bikes. That bike came from downtown. It came from 1.5 miles away from here to get to that location. So that's just another way to think about the transportation, piece,
Yeah.
the connectivity piece.
So you have people going from both ways.
Right, exactly.
So most people can walk along around a track, which is a 1/4 mile in 5 minutes, not run, but walk. So it's a bit of about a 20-25 minute walk to your downtown core, let's say the Arts Center. If that were a better experience, or if you could do it along the trail, certainly you could bike it in a matter of 2 minutes or 3 minutes if the trail extended through here. So connectivity is key, and that was one of the 3 themes that emerged in previous conversations. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
First, just thank you. This is exciting. And I guess the question would be more towards William and Richard. We have the other property that's the Hotchkiss property that's really not too far down. Is there thoughts about, going along the river with this walkway?
So the question is if there would be consideration for connecting all the buildings that were just taken down for the Hotchkiss property, which is at the intersection of Church and Water Street. And so the developers for that project are already in the plan for that project already incorporate a portion of trail along that. It's not defined yet, a portion of trail along that, which is along the river. That's all part of this interconnectivity. Some of the interconnectivity and the trail development is funding based, for which there are programs that the state of Connecticut has, and that is reauthorizing for the city to competitively go after some funding. But to answer your question, yes, absolutely. That trail and the bicycle that you saw up here may have come from a future resident of the Hotchkiss property that's under development now.
I could just add a piece to that too, Jeremy Lightford, city planner. We had our routing study for the Sue Grossman Trail. And as part of that, there was a proposed, long-term extension from the primary Sue Grossman route up to Stillwater. And it passes by the Hotchkiss property and along Midgeon Avenue. So it's part of the long range plan for the trail extension. Thanks for it.
Other questions?
Realize all the buildings and stuff. There's actually a wide area that's actually all the buildings in the river.
Yes.
They thought used to that. They used to use it on the water, with the waterway being found. They got some water.
Right, so, Richard, can you go to one of the environmental site plans? So the comment was, if you live along Midgeon, towards the back of your property, there's a ditch. The ditch was actually the raceway, which brought water to the mill that generated the power. And that is probably about a 4 to 5, in some cases 10-foot dip on that area. So what we're proposing and what we handed out was a notion of a trail that would be more formal, a recreational trail that would provide access to this manufacturing parcel and with further study connections into the neighborhood, because obviously that would be the goal, is to make that into a place that people could visit. Are you a business owner along Midgeon? No? Are you a resident? Yes, okay. So your property abuts this landfill.
Well, area, so I just know that.
Yeah, and there's paths. I mean, people get back there somehow, and it's just ready for a park. And you can do that because it's a landfill and it's safe and clean. I mean, you just have to finish it. So there's a question there, sir. Yeah.
The remediation, that limit what usage?
Well, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
If areas along the river to use as a dumping area, remediation necessary to clean that up, that different levels, does that limit the usage of that space?
Yeah, so everyone heard the question. He's asking about the levels of remediation or investigation that were done along the river. So this is a pretty good plan to show that. The primary investigation that was done in this area was to determine the extent of the filled material, as you can see by this. As I pointed out in the data gap discussion, there are some data gaps. There was a certain level of investigation done here, but there definitely needs to be more before the town, for example, were to utilize it as a trail network. And that grant funding that I talked about for the additional assessment includes both of these parcels, both the manufacturing parcel that we can see from here as well as the north parcel. So further study needs to be done there to answer that.
And if I could add to that, so in the 13 acres in this landfill, you would not build on them. It's not structurally stable soil to build buildings, but why would you do that anyway? You've got vacant buildings next door. In addition, much of this is in the floodplain, so you likely wouldn't want to build in there anyhow, but it could be recreational trails. They could certainly flood. That's not a problem. Yes, sir.
So residential currently in the state of Connecticut, which I should preface, the state of Connecticut is working through a very significant, and that's probably not an overuse of that word, overhaul of their regulations, and the regulatory environment will change as well. Basically that transfer act program that I told you, when a property sells and it triggers all this, all that's going to go away. But to answer your question, currently under residential standards, it would be residential housing and schools and any more formative occupancy like college dorm rooms, let's say, that would be considered a residential use in Connecticut. Daycare facilities.
I'd ask the question probably. If there's different levels of contamination there, and you said you could put residential in one section, but not over here, what defines what can go where?
Okay, so that's so relative to that you're correct. So in the state of Connecticut, there's residential standards, and then there's, we call them industrial commercial standards. Again, higher levels of eminence would expect it to be present there and can be kept there. To answer your question, these land use restrictions, though, those are essentially, I'll call them no build, no dig. Like if you weren't going to be building over it, you weren't going to be able to remove buildings or asphalt that are then covering it, right? So, but there is a larger all-encompassing land use restriction that Brunswick has proposed that says no residential anywhere on the property. The entire footprint of that parcel within the parcel limits would be off limits to residential development if that were to end up being reported on the land records. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, but I'll ask later.
Okay.
So I'll take it just one step further, because the city just went through this process with the project on Franklin Street, 100 Franklin Street, which David showed the picture of the 60 units of housing that just went, it was opened in 2022. And the city went through a remediation process, similar, a lot of environmental contamination, ground soil contamination in that property. And in order to meet the threshold for it to be residential, essentially what the city had to do was dig, test, dig, test, dig, test, dig, test, dig, test, until we got about 16, 18, 20 feet down, test, clear. Fill it back in with clean stuff, build your building. So the residential standard is extreme, and it's extreme for an important reason, because that's where people are living. That's where people are dining. So to meet that, it is, I'll use the word extreme. I don't know if you, environmental professionals would use the word extreme, but it's a much higher standard. Whereas you saw the map, right now, across the street, you could put industrial uses there without doing any additional digging, any additional scooping or filling or monitoring. Does that maybe answer your question a little bit better? That's what we've been looking at for areas. John mentioned the term AOC, areas of concern. That's where they're like the hot spots. Dig, 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 this hot spot. It could be the size of this room. It could be the size of, a table. Right? And so when you define those areas through the investigations, you say, here's where we know the contamination is. If we scoop this out and then we test, scoop it out and we test, now we know this is clean. It changes the map all of a sudden. So maybe that's a little bit more of what you're asking. Right?
This, by the way, is a photograph of that building with the smokestack. This is the boiler house. about 4,000 square feet. That's one large room. Of course, there's lots of old infrastructure. There's Charlie Rose. It needs needs a new roof. It actually needs a little hazardous building materials like a survey done, but it's not hard to imagine that being something that's commercially based. And we've mentioned residential a number of times. There just aren't that many buildings on the 535 manufacturing parcel that would lend themselves well to residential, but all of these other uses are both in demand and more possibly. A question in the room, and if not, we'll see if any came in from remote. Not yet. What we handed out were basically what's on these boards without the posters, and these will be produced and distributed. On the one side is the complex and some different alternatives. On the back side is the trail network. One other thing I just want to mention, because we've had to look at it, is what would happen if portions of the complex were demolished? If they're too expensive to rehabilitate? And why would that be a possibility? Well, because if a developer was interested in some adaptive reuse with some new construction, one could actually subdivide the parcel into a number of properties and sell them off incrementally. So we've been encouraging the property owner to think about that as a scenario where maybe they don't sell it all, but they sell off portions that might allow some other new construction that would be possibly less expensive and even built more to scale. You could put, if you see on the poster on the right-hand side, we were showing new development that might be 3, 4-story residential, mixed use. So that is another alternative, and we did look at it, but they actually asked us to look at what would happen if some new construction happened, and that is another scenario. We didn't focus on that because we do think the history of the city is evident in this complex and it should be embraced and celebrated. However, if they sold the property tomorrow, it's possible that a developer would be interested in that as a scenario. So we just looked at what the capacity would be, but it's not, I think, what the community expressed as a desire previously, and it's not what we're advocating for. Well, with that, as a team, we're going to stick around. These have been great questions, and they demonstrate, I think, your intelligence that this is a difficult problem, but it's not insurmountable. And there's lots of good indicators that suggest that this property could be something different in the future. Thank you.
Not too many acronyms. If you are misbehaving.
I like